I think we're going to go ahead and start. My name is Caroline Parker. I'm a 2L at the law school, and I'm excited to welcome you to today's lunch talk on regulating greenhouse gas emissions from animal agriculture. This is the penultimate event in the fall speaker series hosted by Yale's Law, Ethics, and Animals program. And the final event on ecological risks of deep sea mining will be next Thursday, November 4th at this same time. Thank you to Yale's Sustainable Food Program, the Yale Environmental Law Association, and the Yale Animal Law Society for co-sponsoring this event. I'd like to start by just setting the stage a little bit. The latest scientific estimates tell us that industrial meat and dairy production are responsible for up to a third of global emissions. This means that in addition to being a moral catastrophe, the current model of industrial animal agriculture is a critical problem for the climate that must be dismantled if we're to meet any serious emission reductions goals. However, in the words of today's speaker, unlike growing public scrutiny on fossil fuel companies, little public pressure exists to hold global meat and dairy corporations accountable for their emissions. It's my pleasure to introduce Ben Lilliston, who is the Director of Rural Strategies and Climate Change at the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. Ben works at the intersection of climate, agriculture, and trade to advance a just transition framework for farmers in rural communities. Ben has also written extensively about the role that emissions trading and net zero pledges play in greenwashing industrial agriculture. I know Ben's work at IATP has been pivotal in my own understanding about the relationship between the food system and the climate crisis, and I know that I'm not alone in saying that we are so excited to have you here today. To start, Ben is going to talk for about 25 minutes, and then we'll have about 30 minutes for Q&A. So audience members, you can post your questions in the chat, and I'll sort of filter through them and read them. And I believe that there is a group of law students gathered to watch this event together at the law school. So I hope that you all will find a way to generate and communicate your questions in some form on behalf of the group. So without further ado, Ben, you can take it away.
All right, thanks very much. It's great to be here. I really appreciate being invited and to be a part of this. I am going to share my screen. I did put together some slides. I heard that you had a photojournalist as a presenter in an earlier part of this series, so it's not going to be that compelling as the amazing photos I'm sure that you saw, but I'm going to, let's see, make sure this works first. And so, all right, I'm seeing some head nods that this is working. So yes, I work at the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. We're based in Minnesota. We have an office in Washington, D.C. as well. And I'm going to talk about regulating greenhouse gas emissions from animal ag, but for IATP, we also look at sort of the broader picture, not just the regulatory hammer about how do we set up a policy framework to create a just transition away from this factory farm system. This is just a little bit about IETP, so you know where we're coming from. We were formed during the farm crisis in the 1980s, when farmers were trying to understand what sort of national and even international policies were causing that crisis. Massive farm foreclosures, a lot of farmer suicides and that sort of thing. And there were similar sorts of situations were happening in other parts of the world. So we're sort of a US node connecting with other similar type of organizations looking at global policy frameworks, but also national and even local. We have worked on this factory farm issue. That's what we call animal ag, particularly this particular factory farm system of raising animals. For quite a while. It's been a serious trend over the last 30 years at least, probably predating that a little bit. So in 2000, we put out this report, The Price We Pay for Corporate Hogs. Oops, no, I just kind of jumped ahead, which was documenting these really serious changes happening in hog production. 2014, we did a series on China and its embrace of industrial animal production, but it really was a look at the global system and how these companies are global, engaging in the system, as well as how they operate in different parts of the world. 2017, we did this Emissions Impossible report, which looked at big meat and dairy companies and their greenhouse gas emission contributions. And then last year, we did this report on dairy specifically, sort of updating that report and looking at how big dairy, their climate contributions. So why is this issue really rising, at least in my experience, having worked on these issues for 20 years, is that some of the science is kind of catching up to what we sort of sensed or thought. I don't know how many of you have read this Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's really dark. It starts off really scaring people, as it should, because there's a lot of science behind it. But one of the things that was interesting is that they didn't just talk about carbon. They really pulled out nitrous oxide and methane for the first time, and in a more deliberate way. And they really emphasized methane because methane is a short-lived pollutant. It's only in the atmosphere for 10 to 12 years. Carbon dioxide is in there for over 100 years often. And so the basic point was we can make some big gains in the climate fight if we dramatically reduce methane emissions quickly. And it can buy us some time as we continue to try to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. So this was released during the summer, and I think gives a little more scientific sort of standing in targeting methane as a pollutant as part of climate policy. The other big thing that happened shortly thereafter was the US, this headline's a little misleading, but the US and the European Union agreed to a methane agreement, and they got 28 other countries on board at that time, and I believe this was early September. And they have agreed to reduce methane emissions by 30% by 2030. So here you have two pretty global powers acknowledging that methane's a real problem, making this kind of broad commitment in true sort of, I would say, international climate talk fashion. It's a very vague commitment. It doesn't say we're going to reduce animal ag by a certain amount, or it doesn't differentiate by sector, but it's still a pretty big step and really sets sort of a foundation for trying to reduce these emissions, we feel like. So next week, they're going to announce this agreement in more detail, so you have the actual text, but also probably we'll have more countries have committed to that. I think they'll do that announcement at the Glasgow meeting next week. So the other thing that I think is sort of putting this issue into focus is a lot of companies are starting, meat companies and dairy companies are starting to feel defensive about this. And our report that we put out late 2017 was the first one, I think, to really call these companies out and really start to put some numbers behind their greenhouse gas contributions. And we did this by taking sort of industry data, both from the company, but also industry publications on production. And then we put that through the UN Food and Agriculture Organization has a model called the GLEAM model, Global Land Use, Environment, and Ag Method, I believe. It's kind of a wonky title, but basically they accommodate for different parts of the world. So different parts of the world are going to have different types of greenhouse gas emissions. So we took the production of these companies and including the fact that many of them are global, so producing in different parts of the world, and put it through this GLEAM methodology that estimates emissions. And we were pretty clear this is an estimate, like most sort of greenhouse gas estimates. But we surprisingly did not get a lot of pushback from these companies, except for Fonterra, which is a dairy company out of New Zealand. And we were pretty surprised. that when you start to look at these companies and their responsibility for greenhouse gas emissions, it's pretty significant, and they've been really under the radar, as Carolyn said in the introduction previously. So they're getting more defensive, and they're starting to put out a lot of climate plans publicly to respond to shareholders and to respond to media scrutiny around climate change. We did a quick update last year, particularly targeting the dairy industry. And just over the last 2 years, you can see their production increasing and their greenhouse gas emissions increasing. So I'll go into dairy in a little bit as we go through this. You may be familiar with this. This is the US greenhouse gas inventory that the Environmental Protection Agency puts out every year. They'll probably put out a new one in early next year for 2020 numbers. But you can see agriculture is 10%. But what I want to highlight here is that the concern is that agriculture, unlike some of the other sectors, is actually increasing emissions. And the EPA is fairly explicit that the reason these emissions are rising is having to do with this factory farm system of livestock production, their manure management systems, and particularly how they liquefy the manure. So, and particularly they're talking about hogs and dairy. And that's been not surprising if you've been following US agriculture and the trends, but you're getting emissions from the animals, particularly in dairy cows. You're getting emissions from the waste that's produced and stored in giant manure lagoons, and then you're getting emissions from the waste applied to fields, often over-applied and sometimes entering waterways. And so this is, I think, putting, all these things are sort of putting this issue on the radar, and I think we would say calling for some kind of policy response and sometimes type of regulatory response. Just really quickly, you all may be familiar with this, but it just shows, this is just a chart to show the way these industries are going. We're just moving to fewer but much bigger hog operations. And most of these, so this is over 5,000 head, and you can see the massive growth there. All these operations are tied to hog companies. So they're on contract with Smithfield or JBS to produce that. So it's an interesting relationship in that they're not necessarily independent farmers, but they're tightly controlled by these companies. And this is why we place a lot of emphasis on the companies and their responsibility for these emissions. This is another chart from Foodprint. If you're not familiar, Foodprint's a really good newsletter that covers a lot of these issues. But you can see the massive loss in dairy farms that we've experienced in this country, but we're producing more milk. And a lot of this is because we're fewer but much larger, what we call mega dairies. And that shift is, linked back to the EPA rise in emissions. And as opposed to, just to take a step back, a smaller size dairy or even a mid-sized dairy is not going to produce as much singular amounts of manure, and is going to, when it applies it to the field, it's going to be a more appropriate level of a manure application. So it's not going to emit as much. And many of those dairies are probably more likely to have their cows out on pasture, which is just a whole different system. I think most people agree it's a less emitting system, although still possibly emitting. What are we doing about this? So IETP is not a legal organization, but we work with a lot of public interest law nonprofits and some really good ones. And this is a petition that we were involved with earlier this year by Public Justice, which is a great group. And basically calling on the EPA given the data that we reviewed and going into that a little bit more deeply, that they should regulate methane emissions from large hog and dairy operations under the Clean Air Act, Section 111. And we believe the EPA has the authority to do this, and they could start rulemaking process. So this is part of an effort to try to pressure them to do that, and we'll see. But we feel like if the U.S. is going to be part of a global methane agreement, they need to take that seriously, and animal agriculture needs to be part of that discussion. Here's another sort of legal petition that we were part of, led by Food and Water Watch. And if you're not familiar with them, they're a great group that does some grassroots organizing, but also has a legal arm. And, you know, this is challenging the EPA this is one of the bigger issues in taking on this industry, is they have a lot of exemptions and sort of regulatory exemptions, saying we're a farm, we're not, you know, a point source, we're not a manufacturing plant, we need to be treated differently. And this is kind of an amazing story of 16 years ago. Basically, the hog industry said, you shouldn't be regulating us for air pollution. There's not good methodology out there. Let's go do a research project on proper methodology and give us some time to figure that out. And it's been 16 years and they've never figured it out. The EPA hasn't done anything. So you have a lot of, particularly hog CAFOs, with regulatory exemptions around air pollution laws and reporting, which you know, is not direct climate, although I believe methane is part of that. But it's a broader example of how many exemptions this industry has when it comes to environmental protection. This other lawsuit that we're a part of is led by the Animal Legal Defense Fund, and they're really good. You may be familiar with them. But during the Trump administration, the Council on Environmental Quality basically gave exemptions to CAFOs, NEPA exemptions. And this is important because many of these factory farms have trouble getting financing from traditional banks. And so they have to go often through the USDA, US Department of Agriculture, to get federally backed loans to help them move forward with the production. And so this is a big deal. If they don't have to, if they're exempted from having to go through the NEPA process to get that federally backed loan, then they can move forward a lot quicker and really expand even more than they already are. For us, and many of you may be probably more experts on NEPA than I am, but the climate, introducing climate issues within NEPA is very significant. And with factory farms, it's, I think, really important. Now, we haven't totally figured it out, but any individual operation is not going to impact the climate, right? But when you start to approve a series of them over time, the cumulative effects are very significant, as we see in the EPA data. And so we feel like there are some steps right now. The Biden administration is taking steps to reverse what the Trump administration did. And they're going through a rulemaking process right now to do that. So we're optimistic that this will be reversed, but it highlights another area where a very powerful industry has won an exemption. Talk a little bit about states, and California is way ahead of everyone on this by at least having a methane target to reduce emissions by 40% by 2030. And that includes dairy and livestock sector. So it's good that they have a target. Whether they're going to reach that target is unclear. And they use a lot of, I think it's a bit controversial out there because they are really supporting the use of dairy digesters. So these are big methane digesters they put on the manure lagoons to capture the methane and then often pipe into natural gas pipelines. And a lot of people who surround those dairies are not big fans of this because they still have the manure, and in fact, you're creating a financial incentive to produce more manure by capturing this gas. There's still some emissions, both air pollution and methane still gets out to some extent. And you also sort of greenwashing the natural gas industry because that counts as renewable fuel. So it's they're struggling with this, and it'll be interesting to see how they reach it. But at least they've set a target, and I think that's important. We are based in Minnesota. I'm in Minnesota, so I'll talk a little bit about Minnesota because it's going through an interesting process that's different than a lot of other ag states. So the state was reconsidering its environmental review program this last year and how they could integrate climate change within that environmental review program. And that program approves, any new project of a particular size, including feedlots. And so we've experienced this large growth, particularly of big dairies, but also big hog operations. And they often get approved very quickly. And so for the first time, they were trying to figure out how would we put climate into that environmental review program. And once you start to get into the details, it gets very complicated. Where are you measuring and what are you measuring? Are you measuring the feed that goes to the animals, then the manure, then how the manure is applied to the field? There's a lot of carbon accounting debates that went on over the last year. And they basically decided to do a pilot program and test it out for a year with certain new projects. And then hopefully it will be fully adopted at the end of next year. But I'm not aware of another Midwest agriculture state considering this. And it really brings up a lot of good discussion about what alternative systems might look like. How are you going to also adapt to climate change? That's another thing I haven't talked about, but you can see that manure lagoon in that photo. They're very vulnerable to extreme climate events. And there's been manure spills a lot in North Carolina related to hurricanes, but also in Iowa and parts of the Midwest when tornadoes hit or other extreme events. And the last thing I'll talk about a little bit is for IETP, as I mentioned a bit at the beginning, it's thinking about how do we transition this system. And regulations are really important. But the other part of that is how do we create a pathway towards a different system of agriculture and farming and rural economies. So the Farm Systems Reform Act was introduced by Senator Cory Booker and is really a really interesting and in some ways powerful piece of legislation because it would place a moratorium on new large-scale factory farms. So the EPA has a designation for confined animal, concentrated animal feeding operations. And so it would be just the large-scale ones as defined by the EPA. And then it would have a phase-out of those operations by 2040. And it also has a buyout program for farmers who are, as I mentioned, they're often kind of caught in this system. They're under contract with really powerful global players, and it's not easy for them to transition. And there's been a host of incentives for them to go this direction. So we feel like that's a really interesting piece of legislation that really considers what a just transition might look like. The Farm Bill comes up in 2030, and the Farm Bill has all kinds of incentives that drive this factory farm system. It has conservation programs like EQIP that directly subsidize those CAFOs. And we mentioned these guaranteed loans that comes through the Farm Bill. Our commodity policy is really designed to encourage farmers to overproduce corn and soybeans Often they overproduce to the extent that the prices dip below the cost of production. So they're selling these to these large factory farms, and it's in essence a subsidy to continue to produce in this manner. It's a sort of indirect subsidy to those operations and ultimately to those companies. And then conservation programs, which could help support a transition to a different system, are woefully underfunded. There's huge demand from farmers to access these programs, and a lot of them are about growing different types of crops, putting perennial systems in, raising animals in different ways, like on pasture. There's a whole host of different practices that farmers could be looking at, and they're often closed out. So can we expand those programs and make that part of a transition? Last thing I'll mention, because we are the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, there's really interesting trade debates about the intersection of climate and trade. And how do we set up a trade system and trade rules that support climate action? And in particular, how would they support a change in agriculture and food systems? So the Forest Act is one of the more interesting bills introduced in recent times on this subject, introduced by Representative Blumenauer and Senator Schatz. And what it would do is basically say any commodity that is linked to deforestation and its production, the US could ban its import. So for example, if JBS was producing beef in Brazil and that beef production was linked to deforestation, the US could block the import of that beef. This is a major move, a major step forward in thinking about trade and climate and food. Right now, the US can block wood products from that result from illegal deforestation. Most of our trade agreements have provisions in that, but to add in commodities linked to illegal deforestation is a big step. The other is this really widening debate about something called a carbon border adjustment tax. So this is pretty wonky, but Europe is moving forward with this particular proposal. And basically what it says is, if you're in another country and you have weak climate laws, if we're going to import a product from you, we're going to place a tax on that so that it doesn't undermine our market. So for example, and this is most of what Europe is looking at is not agriculture related, except for fertilizer. They are including fertilizer in that. And I think the significance is not only for Europe, but other countries around the world are looking at this, including the US, and this has been discussed in Congress as well. Like, what would that look like in the US? And the thinking behind it, again, is how can we take action on climate change, but not be undercut by countries that aren't taking action on climate change? So for example, if the EPA put in force that methane rules or regulations around CAFOs, what would stop the companies from just shifting over to Mexico or Canada, where they already have a presence, and bringing that food into the United States and just working around it? How do we prevent the offshoring of pollution? And so there's a lot of really interesting debates happening around that intersect with agriculture in our food system. I'm going to take a breath, but covered a lot of ground. I really welcome questions and also ideas, because you all probably have been thinking about this as well. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Feel free to get in touch with me if you have questions too. You can see my email there. Great. Thanks, everybody.